The neighbors called him crazy. And honestly, if you had seen what they saw, a man in the middle of dry land, miles from any river or ocean, swinging an axe at trees the size of buildings, you might have said the same thing. No blueprints, no engineers, no cranes, no iron nails, no manual telling him what to do next. Just a command from God, a set of measurements, and decades of his life stretching out before him like an empty desert. 137 meters long, 23 meters wide, 3 full floors. The Bible gives you the numbers. It does not give you the how. It does not tell you how to fall a tree that weighs several tons without killing the men beside you. It does not explain how to bend wood into curves without splitting it. It does not describe what it feels like to spend years sealing every crack of a structure you can never test on water, trusting, with every brushstroke of hot pitch, that the calculations are right and the structure will hold. Noah received the order, and then he had to figure out the rest himself. This is the story that the Bible leaves between the lines. The story of calloused hands and aching muscles, of sons who grew up on a construction site instead of a childhood, of a man who woke up every single morning for decades and chose again to keep building something the world had never seen. For a flood the world refused to believe was coming. Most people know that Noah built the ark. Very few people have stopped to ask, how exactly did he do it? What did day 1 look like? What did year 10 look like? What kept him going when the wood splintered, when the ropes snapped, when the neighbors laughed so loudly he could hear them from inside the forest? This channel exists for the questions hiding inside the stories you already know. Not to replace your faith, but to deepen it. Because when you understand how hard this was, you will never read the story of Noah the same way again. Stay with us. Because with this, man built and why he built it is one of the most extraordinary acts of obedience in human history. And it started with a single, impossible decision: to pick up an axe and begin. There is a moment buried somewhere in the silence between God's words and Noah's first swing of the axe that no one talks about. The moment Noah said yes. Not the dramatic yes of a man who has nothing to lose. The quiet, terrifying yes of a man who understood exactly what he was agreeing to. A man with a family, a home, a life already built, who looked at the sky, heard the voice of God, and chose to believe something so impossible that every rational instinct in him must have screamed to walk away. God's instructions were precise and, at the same time, utterly incomplete. Make yourself an ark of cypress wood. Make rooms in it and coat it with pitch inside and out. This is how you are to build it. The ark is to be 300 cubits long, 50 cubits wide and 30 cubits high. 300 cubits. In modern measurements, 137 meters long, 23 meters wide, 13 meters tall across 3 full floors. The Bible gives you the dimensions the way an architect hands you a finished blueprint, clean, certain, final. What it does not give you is everything that comes before the first nail, before the first cut, before the first tree falls, Because before Noah could build anything, he had to answer a question that the Bible never addresses directly. Where? This sounds simple. It is not. Think about what 137 meters actually means. It means a structure longer than a modern football field. It means you cannot build against a hillside, because the hill would eventually give way under vibration and weight. You cannot build in a valley, because drainage becomes impossible and rain turns your worksite into a swamp. You cannot build too close to a forest, because falling trees during construction could destroy months of work, but you cannot build too far from trees either, because moving heavy timber long distances without wheeled carts or machines is one of the most brutal forms of labor a human body can endure. The ideal site needed to be flat, firm, large enough not just for the structure, but for the chaos that surrounds any massive construction: timber yards, tool storage, drying areas for planks, work paths wide enough for men carrying logs on their shoulders. And it needed water. Fresh water. Because men doing hard physical labor in heat and wood dust need to drink constantly. But not too much water. Not too close to a river that could flood seasonally, washing tools downstream and softening the ground beneath a structure that would eventually weigh thousands of tons. Noah walked the land. He studied it the way a man studies a decision he cannot take back, slowly, carefully, with full awareness that getting this wrong would cost everything. We do not know how long it took him to find the right place. The Bible does not record that particular search. But any experienced builder will tell you, choosing the wrong site is how projects die before they begin. When Noah finally chose his ground, the real work started, and it was nothing like the dramatic image most people carry in their minds. There was no timber rising toward the sky on day one. No skeleton of a ship taking shape against the horizon. Day one was dirt. Specifically, removing it, leveling it, compacting it, and shaping it into something that could bear an impossible weight without cracking or shifting over the years of construction that followed. This meant pulling rocks from the ground by hand. Rocks that had settled there for centuries, some small enough to carry, some large enough to require ropes and levers and the combined strength of multiple men, just to roll a few meters out of the way. It meant cutting roots. Ancient root systems, thick as a man's torso, tangled deep underground, anchoring trees that were no longer standing. You cannot compact soil that is threaded through with roots. They decay. They leave hollow channels. Under enough weight, the ground above them collapses inward like a slow exhale. So every root had to be found, cut, and pulled. Work that is invisible from the outside. Work that leaves no monument, produces nothing you can point to and say, I made this, and yet without it, everything else would eventually fail. And then, drainage. Because a construction site without a drainage plan is just a future swamp. The Middle East receives rain, not the tropical downpours of other regions, but enough. Enough to turn exposed soil into mud that swallows tools, warps unseasoned wood, and stops work entirely while men wait for ground to firm up again.
The slope holds true.
Noah needed channels.
We are ready.
Long, shallow trenches, dug at strategic angles around the perimeter of the site. designed to catch rainwater and direct it away before it pooled. It is unglamorous engineering, the kind of work that ancient builders understood deeply and that modern people rarely think about. But here is what strikes me every time I sit with this part of the story. While Noah was digging drainage trenches, while he was pulling roots and moving rocks and leveling a field in the middle of nowhere, his neighbors were watching. And they were not silent. The mockery started early, and it never really stopped.
Look at it!
Imagine what it looked like from the outside.
Pathetic!
A man, clearly intelligent enough to organize serious construction work, spending weeks, maybe months, preparing ground for a project he claimed God had ordered him to build. A boat. A massive boat. In a region with no significant body of water anywhere near it. The neighbors did not need to understand hydraulics or structural engineering to see that this made no sense. A boat requires water. There was no water. Therefore, madness. They laughed. They pointed. They told their children to come and watch the crazy man dig his drainage channels for a ship that would never sail. And Noah kept digging. This is the part of faith that rarely gets preached about in comfortable buildings with clean floors, the specific, grinding endurance of believing something that makes you look foolish to everyone around you. Not the sudden miracle. Not the dramatic moment when God parts the sea or sends fire from heaven. The long, quiet, humiliating middle where nothing supernatural is happening, where it is just you in the dirt and a sound of laughter from people who used to respect you. Noah did not have a timeline. God told him to build not when it would be finished, not when the rain would come. He built in the dark, in every sense of the word. And yet somehow he kept going. When the ground was finally ready, level, compacted, drained, solid, Noah stood at the edge of his empty site and looked at what months of preparation had produced. Nothing visible. Nothing impressive. No word yet, no structure, no ship. Just a field. But beneath that field was something invisible and absolutely essential, a foundation strong enough to hold what was coming. The neighbors saw nothing worth looking at. Noah saw everything. There is a sound that every man on Noah's crew knew by heart. Not the sound of the axe hitting wood, though they heard that thousands of times. Not the sound of rope snapping under load, or the groan of a heavy log rolling across uneven ground. The sound they knew deepest was the silence that came after a tree started to fall. That fraction of a second between the final crack of a splitting trunk and the thunderous impact on the forest floor, when every man froze, every breath stopped, and every eye tracked the shadow of something enormous moving through the canopy above them. Because in that silence, no one knew exactly where it would land. That silence was the sound of consequence, of work that could not be undone.
The forest is thick with
And Noah's
dust.
crew lived inside it, over and over, 3 years,
Thick to breathe.
before a single plank could be cut, before the skeleton of the ark could begin to rise. Noah needed wood. Not a little wood. Not the kind of timber you gather for a house or a barn. He needed wood on a scale that the ancient world had almost no framework to imagine. The Bible specifies the material: gopher wood, most likely cypress. Dense, resilient, resistant to water and rot in ways that most other trees are not. Cypress was not chosen randomly. It was chosen because it was the right material for the right job, and that specificity tells us something important about the nature of the instruction Noah received. God did not say find some trees. He named the wood. But naming the wood and obtaining the wood are two entirely different problems. A mature cypress tree grows for decades before it reaches the size needed for serious structural timber. Some of the trees Noah would have needed were older than he was tall, massive, with root systems that spread underground like entire hidden architectures of their own. A single tree of the size required for the ark's major beams could weigh several tons. Not the weight of something you lift, the weight of something you negotiate with. And Noah needed not dozens of these trees, hundreds, possibly thousands, when you account for waste, the cuts that split wrong, the planks that cracked during drying, the beams that turned out to have hidden rot at their core. In large-scale ancient construction, waste was not the exception. It was built into the plan. So the forest came first. Cutting a tree with a bronze axe is nothing like cutting wood with modern steel tools. Bronze dulls faster. It requires more force per strike to achieve the same penetration. And against the trunk the diameter of a man's arm span, which is what Noah was dealing with for the major structural timbers, a single axe is almost useless. The solution was rhythm and partnership. 2 men, one on each side of the trunk, alternating strikes in a pattern that kept the cut progressing while giving each man just enough recovery time between swings to maintain force. Hours of this. The kind of repetitive, muscle-destroying labor that leaves your arms so fatigued by midday that lifting the axe feels like lifting the tree itself. The cut had to be guided. You cannot simply hack at a tree and hope it falls where you want it. A tree falling in the wrong direction could kill the man standing beside you, could crash into the surrounding forest and lodge itself at an angle, making retrieval nearly impossible, could split along its length on impact with the ground, and a split beam is a useless beam. Months of effort destroyed in a single second of poor planning. So before the first strike, Noah's crew studied the tree. They read its lean, the subtle tilt that gravity had built into it over decades of growth. They looked at the surrounding canopy, identifying which direction gave the cleanest fall paths. They cut wedges on the side they wanted it to fall toward, controlling the direction the way a surgeon controls a cut, not with brute force alone, but with precision applied in exactly the right place. And then, as the tree began to shudder and lean, they attached long ropes, tied high on the trunk, pulled by men positioned well away from the fall zone, guiding the descent, degree by degree, toward the chosen paths. When it finally hit the ground, the impact was not just sound. It was felt through the soles of every foot in the forest. A vibration that traveled through the earth like a slow wave. And then the silence. And then the real work. A fallen tree is not timber. It is a problem. The branches have to come off, every one of them, cut close to the trunk, leaving a surface smooth enough to work with. The bark has to be stripped in sections, because bark traps moisture, and moisture is the enemy of wood that needs to dry and cure before it can hold structural load. And the trunk itself, this object that weighs several tons, lying on a forest floor that is uneven, rooted, and in no way designed for the movement of heavy objects, has to travel, somehow, from here to the construction site, without wheels, without engines, without anything that the modern world takes for granted when it thinks about moving heavy objects. The most reliable solution available to ancient builders was the roller system, a technique used independently by the Egyptians, the Mesopotamians, and cultures across the ancient world, because it works with physics rather than against it. You cut a series of smaller logs, thinner, shorter, easier to handle and lay them perpendicular to the direction of travel, spaced at intervals across the ground. You position the heavy timber on top of them. You attach ropes to the front end, and then you pull. As the load rolls forward on the cylinders beneath it, the rearmost roller is freed from the ground. A man picks it up, carries it to the front of the line, places it down ahead of the advancing timber, and the process repeats. It is slow, brutally, almost insultingly slow for the amount of effort it requires. Moving a single large timber any meaningful distance could take an entire day's work from multiple men. And Noah needed hundreds of timbers. But here is what the roller system actually demanded that no one thinks about: roads. You cannot roll a several-ton log across a forest floor threaded with roots and scattered with rocks. The log catches, the rollers dig in, and you lose all your momentum, sometimes violently, as the load shifts and men scramble to get clear of something that outweighs them by a factor of 20. So before any timber could be moved, paths had to be cleared. Wide, level paths from the felling sites to the construction area, roots grubbed out, rocks dragged aside, low spots filled and compacted. Secondary infrastructure built in service of the primary project. More weeks of work. More invisible labor producing nothing you could point at with pride. Noah had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. 4 men total in the family. For the heaviest timber movements, 4 men pulling ropes is almost certainly not enough. The Bible does not tell us whether Noah hired outside labor, but the logic of the construction suggests he must have, at some point, engaged workers from the surrounding community, men who needed income and cared nothing about the theological reasons behind the project. Men who probably went home in the evenings and told their families about the enormous, inexplicable boat being built by that strange family on the flat ground north of town. And those families probably laughed. But they kept showing up to work, because work was work, and Noah paid in something: food, goods, whatever the economy of that time and place ran on. Here is what I find quietly remarkable about that possibility. The ark may have been built, in part, by people who did not believe in it. Hands that mocked the project in private helped construct the very vessel that would preserve life on earth. God's purposes moving through people who had no idea they were serving them. That is a thought worth sitting with. Each log that arrived at the construction site carried the weight of everything it had cost to get there. Days of felling, days of limbing and stripping, days of slow, grinding transport across forest paths that had themselves required days to prepare. And the moment it arrived, it was stacked carefully, with spacers between layers to allow air circulation and left to dry. Because green wood moves, it shrinks as moisture leaves it. It warps, twists, and cracks if forced into structural use before it has stabilized. A beam cut from a living tree and immediately used in construction will pull joints apart as it dries. It will open gaps and sealed surfaces. It will compromise everything around it. So Noah waited. He stacked and he waited, and while he waited, he sent his sons back into the forest to fell the next tree. The cycle had no natural end point. There was no day when enough wood had arrived. There was only the work that needed to happen today, and the work waiting for tomorrow. Somewhere in those years of felling and hauling and stacking and waiting, something shifted in the way Noah's family understood what they were doing. This was no longer a construction project. It was a way of life. The ark was not something they were building. It was something they were becoming, shaped by it, defined by it, inseparable from it. The neighbors still laughed, and the wood pile gaped, growing. If this story is moving something in you, if the image of a man building in faith while the world mocks is speaking to something you recognize in your own life, then this channel is for you. We exist to go deep into the stories that shaped the world, to find the human truth buried inside their divine record. Subscribe now and join a community that takes these ancient stories seriously, not just as history, but as a mirror held up to the present moment. Because Noah's story is not just about a flood. It is about what happens when one person refuses to stop building, even when no one believes in what they are making. Stay with us. There is so much more to come. The moment Noah laid the first beam on the prepared ground, everything changed. Not because the hard work was over. It was not. The hardest work in many ways was just beginning. But something shifted in the psychology of the project the moment wood met earth in a deliberate, structural way. For months, the site had been preparation in absence. Cleared ground, stacked timber, invisible infrastructure. Now there was something. And something, after so long, felt like everything. Every ship ever built, from the smallest fishing vessel to the largest ocean liner, begins with the same element: the keel. The single foundational beam that runs the entire length of the hull, from bow to stern, serving as the structural spine from which everything else grows. Without the keel, you do not have a ship.
It is beyond belief.
You have a collection of wood that happens to be near water.
Is a testament
Noah's
to our
keel
resolve.
needed to be 137 meters long. There is no tree on Earth, there has never been a tree on Earth, with a usable trunk that stretches 137 meters. The tallest trees in the world today reach perhaps 115 meters in total height, and their usable structural timber is a fraction of that. Noah was not going to find a single piece of wood long enough to serve as his keel, which meant he had to build it. Specifically, he had to join multiple large beams, end to end, in a connection strong enough to behave as a single unified structure under the enormous stresses that a vessel on open water would experience. Because a keel is not a passive element. It flexes. It absorbs the force of waves pushing up from below while the weight of the entire structure presses down from above. The joint between two beams in a keel is one of the most mechanically demanding connections in all of ancient woodworking. The solution was the scarf joint, a technique developed independently by shipbuilders across the ancient world because the physics demanded it. Instead of cutting two beams square at the end and placing them face to face, a connection that would have almost no tensile strength, you cut each end at a long diagonal, creating overlapping surfaces with far greater gluing area. Then you lock the joint with wooden pegs, treenails, in the language of traditional boat building, driven through both pieces at angles that resist the joint being pulled apart in any direction. Done correctly, a well-cut scarf joint is not the weak point of the beam. It is sometimes stronger than the wood on either side of it. Noah could not afford, sometimes. He needed always. Each joint in that 137-meter keel was cut,
No, that's not right.
fitted,
Recut the angle.
tested
Again?
by feel and
We just
eye,
put it there. Do it
adjusted,
now. It must be perfect.
refitted, and tested again, because a keel that fails at sea does not fail slowly. It fails completely, catastrophically, and finally. With the keel laid and secured, the ribs could begin.
Keep pulling.
The
Steady.
ribs of a ship are its
1, 2,
visible
3,
identity,
pull.
the curved members that rise from the
Watch the
keel
ropes,
on
don't
both
stop.
sides, giving the hull its shape and enclosing the interior space. They are what transforms a straight line into a vessel. And they presented Noah with a technical challenge that the Bible mentions in exactly
Pull.
0 words.
Pull together.
How do you
Keep
bend
pulling.
wood?
1,
Wood, in its
2,
natural state,
3.
does not bend. It breaks. Apply lateral force to a dry timber and it will resist. Resist. Resist and then snap, suddenly and without warning, releasing stored energy in a fracture that can send splinters flying at dangerous velocity. You cannot simply force a straight beam into a curve. But wood in its natural state is not the only option. Heat and moisture change everything. When wood is exposed to steam, hot, pressurized steam, sustained over time, the lignin that binds its cellular structure begins to soften. The wood becomes temporarily
Keep pushing.
plastic,
It's moving.
pliable.
Hold it.
You can bend it
Just a little more.
slowly and carefully
Almost there.
into curves that it would never accept in its dry state. And if you hold it in that curved position while it cools and dries, fixing it with clamps, with weights, with ropes tied to stakes in the ground, it will retain the new shape permanently. Noah's crew almost certainly used this technique. The evidence is not in the Bible, it is in the physics. There is no other method available to ancient builders for producing the consistent, large radius curves required for ship ribs of this scale. In practice, this meant building some form of steaming apparatus, a closed chamber or trough where wood could be suspended over boiling water long enough for the heat to penetrate the full thickness of the beam. A fire maintained at consistent temperature. Workers monitoring the process, testing the wood's flexibility by hand, knowing from experience when it was ready and how long they had to work with it before it began to cool and stiffen
It's
again.
stuck. It's not moving.
A rib that cooled too
can't do
quickly
it.
before reaching its
Break.
final position
Come
would
on.
lock into the wrong angle. A rib cooled in exactly the right position after hours of careful bending and adjustment became a permanent, load-bearing arc, as strong as the tree it came from. And Noah needed dozens of them, each one slightly different from the last, because the hull of a ship is not a uniform curve. It narrows at the bow and stern. It widens toward the middle. Each rib had to be cut and bent to its specific position, specific requirements. This is precision work, patient work, work that cannot be hurried without being ruined. Here is something I think about often when I sit with this part of Noah's story. He was building a shape he had never seen. Most craftsmen learn their trade by watching, by apprenticing, by making smaller versions of things before attempting larger ones. A carpenter builds chairs before he builds houses. A boat builder constructs small vessels before he attempts large ones, learning how wood behaves on water, how joints respond to stress, how a hull shape affects stability. Noah had none of that progression available to him. He was not building a bigger version of something he had already built.
Look upon your servant.
He was building something that had never existed, to specifications he had received from God in a world that had never seen rain fall from the sky in the way that was coming. Every decision he made was a first. Every problem he encountered had no precedent. Every solution he found by reasoning, by experiment, by faith that the intelligence given to him by his Creator was sufficient to translate divine dimensions into human construction. That is not engineering. That is something deeper than engineering. That is trust made physical. Once the ribs were in place, the structure needed to be locked,
Secure the edge.
not
Slowly.
just held locked.
It's in.
Because a frame of ribs standing upright on a keel before planking is applied is surprisingly fragile. The individual pieces are strong. The assembly, until it is fully connected, is vulnerable to lateral forces, a strong wind, a shift in the ground beneath it. Even the simple mechanical stress of workers climbing on it could cause the whole skeleton to rack and collapse.
Push.
The solution was diagonal bracing.
Slow.
Cross members installed at angles between the vertical ribs, forming triangles throughout the internal structure. The triangle is the only geometric shape that cannot be deformed without breaking one of its sides. A rectangle, under lateral force, becomes a parallelogram. A triangle cannot change its shape at all.
Quicker.
Ancient builders understood this not as geometry but as observation, triangles held in ways that other shapes did not, and they applied it instinctively in structures that needed to resist complex forces. Noah's internal framework would have been a dense web of triangulated bracing, not beautiful, not visible from the outside, not something anyone would praise or admire, but absolutely essential to the integrity of everything that came after. This is another pattern I notice in Noah's story, again and again. The most important work was invisible. The drainage channels no one saw. The road clearing that left no monument. The scarf joints hidden inside a 137-meter keel. The diagonal bracing buried inside walls. The foundation compacted beneath a field of timber and pitch and labor. None of it could be pointed at. None of it could be celebrated publicly. And none of it could be skipped. Because invisible work that is done correctly is what allows visible work to stand. As the skeleton of the ark rose, weeks becoming months, months folding into years, the scale of what Noah was building became impossible to ignore even for those who had tried to dismiss it. The ribs rising against the sky, the keel stretching across the prepared ground like the spine of something enormous and alive. the bracing giving the skeleton a solidity that you could feel when you pressed your hand against it, not the fragile uncertainty of early construction, but the deep, settled firmness of a structure finding its permanent form. The neighbors, who had laughed at a man digging drainage trenches, were now looking up. Some of them, perhaps, felt something shift inside them. Not belief, exactly, but a crack in the certainty of their disbelief. Because there is something about a thing being built slowly, painstakingly, over years of visible daily effort that eventually demands to be taken seriously, even by those who find its purpose absurd. Noah noticed none of this. Or if he did not stop to collect it as vindication. He was already thinking about what came next. Because a skeleton, no matter how perfect, is not a ship. And what came next would test every joint, every beam, every decision he had made since the day he first picked up an axe in a forest that did not know it was about to become something sacred. The planking, the ceiling, the moment of truth that no amount of skill or faith could let him preview. The moment he would find out if it would hold. There is a particular kind of fear that has no name in any language Noah spoke. It is the fear of a man who has spent years building something he cannot test, who has made 10,000 decisions, each one reasonable, each one carefully considered, and has no way of knowing, until the moment of absolute commitment, whether any of them were right. You cannot float a ship that is still on land. You cannot simulate the pressure of water against a hull that has never touched water. You cannot know, from the inside of a dry construction site, whether the joints will hold, whether the pitch will seal, whether the wood will do what wood is supposed to do when the ocean presses against it from every direction simultaneously. Noah knew this. He knew it every morning when he woke up and every evening when he set down his tools. And he kept working anyway. The Bible's instruction on sealing is direct and unambiguous, coated with pitch inside and out. 4 words that contain an entire engineering decision, one that the builders of ancient vessels sometimes got wrong, to catastrophic consequence. Pitch, or bitumen, a naturally occurring tar-like substance derived from the distillation of organic material, was the waterproofing technology of the ancient world. Heated until liquid, applied with tools or hands to wood surfaces, it penetrates the grain and fills microscopic gaps, creating a barrier that water cannot easily cross. But pitch applied only to the exterior of a vessel is not enough. Water under pressure does not simply press against the outside of a hull and give up. It finds pathways. It follows grain lines in the wood, moves through capillary action along the interface between 2 joined planks, creeps through any imperfection in the outer coating, and then finding itself inside the wood, trapped between the outer ceiling and the unprotected interior. It works. Slowly, relentlessly, it works at the wood from the inside, softening it, encouraging the biological processes of decay that wood's natural enemies use as their entry point. A ship sealed only on the outside rots from within. Slowly, invisibly, until the day the hull no longer has the structural integrity to hold the water back, and then not slowly at all. God specified both sides, inside and out. This is not a redundancy. It is a complete system. Applying
Make sure
pitch
the
to the
ropes are
exterior of the ark was dangerous, exhausting work, but it was work done in open air, with the horizon visible, with the simple comfort of knowing that if the fumes became too thick, you stepped back, breathed, returned. The interior was different. Imagine the lower decks of a structure 137 meters long, sealed on all sides, with limited openings for light and air. The pitch was heated over open fires. It had to be hot enough to remain fluid through the application process, which meant temperatures well above what you would want near your skin.
Get out! Run!
The fumes it produced were dense, acrid, toxic in concentration. Not immediately fatal, but cumulative, the kind of exposure that builds in the body over time, that leaves workers with headaches, with burning eyes, with lungs that felt scraped by the end of each day.
Go! Get out!
Working inside meant
Coughing and
intervals.
panicked gasps.
Apply
Move it.
for as long as you
More
could
coughing.
tolerate the
Help
air.
us! Help us! We need
Retreat to the
air. I
opening.
can't breathe. Get out!
Breathe.
Out now. Fresh air.
Return.
Yes. The air.
Apply more. Retreat again. The work surface itself was uneven. Every joint between planks, every seam where a rib met the howl, every corner where two surfaces met at an angle required careful attention. Pitch flows under gravity. It pulls in low points and leaves thin coverage on vertical surfaces. Multiple coats were necessary. Apply a layer, allow it to cool and contract. Inspect for thin spots or missed areas. Apply another layer over the whole surface. Weeks of this. For a structure the size of a large building, in conditions that modern health and safety standards would shut down immediately. And Noah could not afford to miss a single seam, because somewhere in those thousands of meters of interior joints, a single gap, a hairline crack overlooked in poor light, a seam where the pitch have cooled too quickly and failed to fully penetrate, would admit water. Slowly at first, a drip, a darkening of the wood, and then, as pressure increased, faster and faster. There would be no repair possible once they were at sea. No way to haul the vessel out of the water and recoat the interior. What was sealed before the door closed was sealed forever. Every brushstroke was permanent. Every decision final. When the sealing was complete, when the last coat had been applied and inspected and approved, the interior of the ark had to be transformed from a sealed wooden shell into something capable of housing thousands of living creatures for more than a year. This is the engineering challenge that receives the least attention in most retellings of Noah's story, and it deserves far more. Think about what a year actually means in biological terms.
Move. Get to
A
higher
year of
ground.
eating. A year of waste production. A year of temperature variation, humidity fluctuation, the psychological stress that animals experience when confined. A year of predators and prey sharing enclosed space. A year of disease risk, of parasites, of the endless biological complexity that living systems generate simply by continuing to live. The ark was not a zoo. It was a survival vessel, and it had to function as one with zero outside assistance, zero resupply, and zero possibility of evacuation if something went wrong. The interior was divided into what the Hebrew text calls quionim, a word that means cells or compartments, small enclosed spaces, not open floor plans. not communal areas where species mingled freely. Individual enclosures, separated by walls, sized to the creatures they contained. The logic of this arrangement was not just behavioral, keeping predators from prey, but structural. The weight distribution inside the ark was a critical engineering variable.
Oh, dear God!
A vessel that carries its heaviest load high and its structure is unstable, prone to rolling, to capsizing in heavy seas. A vessel with its heaviest load low and centered is stable. It rights itself when waves push it, returns to equilibrium after each displacement. The heaviest animals, the large herbivores, the megafauna that the ancient world still contained in abundance, belonged on the lowest deck. Not because they needed less light or air than smaller creatures, but because their weight, positioned low and distributed along the length of the hull, would press the keel down and resist the rolling forces of ocean waves. Medium-sized animals on the second deck. Lighter creatures, birds, small reptiles, creatures whose total mass was a fraction of the giants below on the third deck, closest to the ventilation openings. It is elegant engineering. The kind that looks simple from the outside but represents hours of deliberate thinking about forces and counterforces, about what happens to a floating structure when the water it sits on is not flat and still but alive and moving. And then there was the problem that no one at a comfortable distance from the subject wants to think about for very long: waste. Thousands of animals, eating every day, producing waste every day, for more than a year. Without a management system, the lower decks of the ark would have become uninhabitable within weeks. The accumulation of organic waste generates heat through decomposition. It generates methane, a gas that, in sufficient concentration in an enclosed space, becomes explosive and asphyxiating. It generates liquid that pools, that seeps into wood, that accelerates rot, that creates the warm, moist conditions in which disease moves fastest. This was not an abstract problem. It was an existential one. Get the waste management wrong and the animals die before the flood ends, and with them everything the ark was built to save.
Mind the angle.
The most logical solution was passive, inclined floors with channels cut into them, directing liquid waste toward collection points, with drainage openings positioned near the waterline of the floating vessel that would allow periodic release directly into the ocean surrounding them. Simple, requiring no mechanical systems, requiring no human maintenance beyond periodic clearing of any blockages. Using gravity, the one engineering force that requires no fuel and never fails to do the work continuously and silently. For solid waste, the crew of 8 would have managed removal manually, the daily labor of caring for a living cargo that was, in biological terms, completely helpless without them. Not glamorous work. Not the work of heroes in the way that felling trees and raising ribs feels heroic. The quiet, unglamorous, absolutely essential work of keeping things alive. Ventilation was the invisible lifeline. The Bible mentions a window, an opening near the roofline that ran, apparently, along the length of the structure. But a single opening at the top of a 3-story vessel is not a ventilation system. Hot air rises and exits through the top. But something has to enter from below to replace it, where the upper opening creates a vacuum effect that draws foul air up from the lower decks rather than expelling it. Strategic lower openings protected from wave intrusion by overhanging lips of wood, positioned on the sides of the hull above the waterline, would have created the circulation the structure needed. Hot, contaminated air rising and exiting through the roof opening. Fresh air entering through the protected side vents. A passive convection system that required no energy, no maintenance, no mechanical parts that could fail. The food stores occupied dedicated sections of each deck separate from the animal compartments, dry, protected from the moisture that the animals themselves generated. A year's supply of fodder for thousands of creatures represents an almost incomprehensible volume of material. Hay, grain, dried fruit, preserved food in whatever forms the ancient world had developed for long-term storage, organized not just for quantity but for access. Because the 8 people responsible for feeding this cargo had to be able to reach every compartment, every enclosure, every food store every day without the kind of logistical chaos that would have made the task impossible to sustain. When the last partition wall was finished, when the drainage channels were cut and the ventilation tested and the food stores loaded in careful sequence, Noah walked the length of the ark from stern to bow. He ran his hand along the interior walls, warm with pitch, solid, immovable. He looked up at the light coming through the roof opening and felt the air moving, just slightly, carrying the smell of fresh cut wood and pine resin and the distant forest. He had built something that should not exist. A sealed world inside a dying one. A living system designed to outlast the destruction of the systems surrounding it. A vessel built for a flood that had not yet come, by man whose faith had not yet been proven by the one test that would prove it absolutely. The construction was complete. But there was one final piece that Noah had not built, could not build, and had not been asked to build. The door. If what you were hearing in this story is speaking to something real in your own life, if you recognize something of yourself in a man who built faithfully in the dark, who did invisible work that no one celebrated, who kept going when the evidence was thin and the mockery was loud, then you already understand why these stories matter beyond their historical surface. This channel goes deep so that you can go deep into the stories, into yourself. If you have not yet subscribed to it now, join a community that takes the ancient records seriously, that asks the hard questions, that refuses to settle for shallow readings of texts that contain oceans. We are just getting started. And what comes next? The animals, the door, and the moment everything Noah had built was finally, irreversibly tested is the part of the story that will stay with you longest. There is a detail in the story of Noah that most people read past without stopping. It is not the flood itself, not the 40 days of rain, not the rainbow that came after. It is a single sentence, tucked inside the narrative almost as an afterthought, that contains, if you slow down long enough to feel its weight, one of the most profound theological statements in the entire book of Genesis. And the Lord shut him in. Not Noah, not Noah's sons, not any human hand had spent decades building this vessel from raw timber and faith and pitch and exhaustion. God closed the door, and everything that implies about who was ultimately in control of this project from the very beginning, about what Noah's decades of labor actually meant, about the relationship between human effort and divine completion is worth sitting inside for a very long time. But before the door could be closed, it had to be built. And the door of the ark presented Noah with what may have been the single most difficult structural engineering problem of the entire project. A hull is strong because it is continuous. Every plank connects to every adjacent plank. Every rib ties into the keel below and the deck above. The strength of a ship's hull is, in the most literal sense, the strength of its connections, an unbroken web of joined wood distributing stress across the entire structure so that no single point bears more than its share. A door is a hole in that web. Every opening in a structural surface is a point of weakness, a place where the continuity is interrupted, where stress that would otherwise be distributed across the whole surface is instead redirected around the edges of the gap. The larger the opening, the more dramatic the redirection, and the more carefully those edges must be reinforced to compensate. Noah's door could not be small. Giraffes needed to enter. Elephants. Animals of every size that the ancient world contained, some of which dwarf the largest creatures we have today. The opening had to be tall enough and wide enough to accommodate the largest creature that would pass through it, which meant an opening that, in structural terms, represented a significant interruption of the hull's integrity at exactly the location that needed to be strongest. The Bible tells us the door was in the side of the ark, not at the bow, not at the stern, in the lateral hull, which, from a structural standpoint, is actually the better choice. The side walls of a vessel distribute lateral water pressure differently than the end walls. A side door, properly reinforced, is less vulnerable to the direct compressive forces that water exerts against the front and rear of a moving hull. But proper reinforcement was everything. Around that opening, Noah would have built a frame, not simply the door frame in the cosmetic sense that modern buildings use the term, but a structural doubling of the material at every edge of the gap. Beams significantly thicker than the surrounding hull planking. Joints cut deeper and locked with more treenails. Diagonal members running from the corners of the frame into the surrounding structure, transferring the stress that the opening could no longer carry into the intact hull on either side. Think of it as a cast around a fracture. The bone is broken, the hull is interrupted, and the cast does not restore the bone itself but creates an alternative load path, allowing the forces that the missing bone would have carried to travel through a different route to the intact structure beyond. This is what good structural engineering looks like in the presence of an unavoidable weakness. You do not pretend the weakness is not there. You acknowledge it. You map the forces it creates, and you provide an alternative pathway for those forces that is at least as strong as the original. Noah had no textbook for this. He had observation, reasoning, and the practical wisdom that decades of working with wood and load and gravity accumulate in a man who pays attention. The door itself, the moving panel that would fill the opening, presented its own challenges. Wood of the thickness required to seal an opening of this size and withstand the water pressure the ark would experience weighs an enormous amount. Moving it required a mechanical advantage that simple hinges could not provide. The solution was almost certainly a pivot system of vertical axes of rotation, built from dense hardwood, set into sockets at the top and bottom of the frame. allowing the massive door panel to rotate rather than swing on side-mounted hardware. Rotation requires less force than lifting. A door that pivots on a central axis can be moved by far fewer people than a door that swings on edge hinges because the weight on either side of the pivot point partially counterbalances itself. Around the door's edges, where the panel met the frame, the ceiling presented a different challenge than the rest of the hull. The hull planking was fixed, it did not move once installed, and pitch could be applied and allowed to cure into a rigid, permanent barrier. A door must move, which means its seal must accommodate motion without cracking, without losing contact, without admitting water at the moment of maximum pressure. Plant fibers, rope fibers, reeds, material that could compress and conform to surface irregularities soaked in pitch and packed into the gap between door and frame would have created a seal that was simultaneously flexible and waterproof. When the door was pressed closed and the pitch cured around the compressed fibers, the result was a gasket of sorts, ancient in its materials, sophisticated in its function. Noah built it. He built it as well as he knew how. He built it to hold. And then, having built it, he left the closing of it to God. Before the door was sealed, something happened that no amount of engineering could have produced and no human logistics could have organized. The animals came. Not in ones and twos that had to be chased, cornered, captured, and dragged toward an opening they feared. Not in the chaotic, terrifying way that any modern attempt to gather wild animals in one place would inevitably become. They came the way water finds a drain, converging from distances that no human messenger had traveled to communicate the time and place. Moving together, predator and prey, species that under any normal circumstance would have nothing to do with each other except in the relationship of hunter and hunted, with a purposefulness that the text describes without explanation and that resists any explanation, that stays within the boundaries of the natural world. Imagine watching this. You have spent decades building. You have done everything within your human capacity to do. You have felled the trees, moved the timber, raised the frame, bent the ribs, sealed the hull, organized the interior, stored the provisions. You have done the human part, all of it, to the absolute limit of what human effort can accomplish. And now something is happening that is entirely outside your capacity to cause or control. Lions walking past lambs without interest. Serpents moving through grass without striking. Birds arriving in species pairs and landing near the entrance as though they had received an invitation in a language only they could hear. The enormous, patient procession of creatures that had no shared language, no shared history, no shared anything except the destination they were all moving toward. Noah stood and watched what no human being had ever watched before and would never watch again. And each animal went, the text tells us, to its place. Not to a place that a human handled or directed, it towered. To its place as though the knowledge of where it belonged inside that vessel had been written into it before it arrived. This is the moment in the story where all human categories of explanation quietly exit the room. Engineering can account for the keel and the ribs and the pitch and the drainage channels. Faith and patience can account for the decades of labor in the face of mockery. But the animals arriving, self-sorting into their appointed compartments with the calm certainty of creatures who
The
know
storm has
exactly
come.
where they are going. That is something else.
It's the
That
end.
is the signature of a mind larger than the one that built the vessel. 8 people entered last. Noah, his wives, Shem and his wives, Ham and his wives, Japheth and his wives. 8 people who had lived this project from the inside, who had carried timber and mixed pitch and cut joints and built walls and organized compartments and loaded provisions. Walking through the door they had spent years constructing, into the world they had spent years building. The contrast must have been stunning. Outside, the ordinary world, continuing as it always had. People going about their lives. The neighbors who had laughed, now perhaps watching in silence as the last member of this strange family disappeared through the massive door. The sounds of the world that was about to end, wind in the trees, voices in the distance, the unremarkable texture of a day that felt, from the outside, like any other day. Inside, the warmth and noise and aliveness of thousands of creatures settling into an enclosed space. The smell of pitch and animal and dry grass. The creak of timber under the weight of a fully loaded vessel resting on solid ground. The sounds of something preparing to become what it was built to be. And then the door. And the Lord shut him in. Not a human hand. Not the strength of Noah or his sons, though they had strength enough for almost anything this project had required. The closing of the door was an act outside the human portion of this story, the moment where the divine authorship of the whole enterprise became undeniable. Noah had done everything asked of him. To the last detail, to the last joint, to the last coat of pitch on the last interior wall. He had given the project everything a human being could give it. And God completed it. The door closed. The seal held. The world outside continued, unknowing. For 7 more days, the text specifies this strange, suspended week of ordinary time after the door closed and before the rain began, as if the world was being given one final moment to reconsider. It did not reconsider. The rain came, and the ark built by human hands over decades of faithful, invisible, unglamorous, unwitnessed labor rose. There is something I want to say directly to you before this chapter ends. We spend so much of our lives waiting for the dramatic confirmation, the sign that the thing we are building, the relationship, the work, the faith, the quiet obedience that no one around us seems to understand is actually worth building. We want to know, before we commit fully, that it will hold. Noah did not get that confirmation. Not until the water came and the ark rose and the thing he had built with his hands proved, in the most absolute terms possible, that it had been worth every day of invisible effort. He built in the dark. He sealed from the inside, where no one could see the work. He carried timber down roads he built himself, to a site he prepared alone, for a flood that had not yet come. And when everything was ready, when the last human task was done, God closed the door. Your obedience is the vessel. God is the one who closes the door. Build faithfully. The water will come. 137 meters of timber, pitch, and faith. 3 floors. Thousands of creatures. 8 people. One door closed by a hand that was not human. What Noah built was not just a boat. It was proof, physical, measurable, structurally sound proof that a single human being, given a divine instruction and the willingness to obey it completely, can build something the world has never seen and cannot explain. But here is what I want you to carry with you after this video ends. The ark did not save anyone because it was impressive. It did not save anyone because the engineering was elegant or the joinery was perfect or the pitch application was thorough, though all of those things were true, and all of them mattered. It saved because it was finished. Because Noah did not stop at 90%. Did not decide the structure was good enough when the frame was up and the hull was planked and the general shape of the thing was recognizable. He sealed every interior wall. He cut every drainage channel. He reinforced every edge of every opening. He kept working on the invisible things, the things no one would ever see or praise or even know existed, until there was nothing left to do. Completion is a form of faithfulness that our culture does not celebrate enough. We celebrate beginnings. We celebrate the dramatic moments, the axe hitting the first tree, the keel laid on prepared ground, the skeleton rising against the sky. We do not celebrate the 10,000th coat of pitch applied in a dark interior space with burning eyes and aching hands, with no audience and no applause. But that coat of pitch is what kept the water out. Noah built for decades without seeing the flood, without a single drop of confirmation that what he was building would ever be needed, would ever float, would ever be anything more than the largest monument to madness his neighbors had ever seen. He built anyway. And when the rain finally came, when the water rose and the ark lifted off the ground it had rested on for all those years of construction, every joint held, every seam sealed, every decision made in faith proved, in the most definitive test possible, to have been the right decision. The world outside the ark did not survive what it refused to prepare for. The world inside the ark, built by human hands, completed by divine closure, carried by water that destroyed everything it touched, arrived safely on the other side of the end of the world. That is what faithful building produces. Not immunity from the storm, passage through it. If this story has meant something to you, if somewhere in Noah's decades of invisible labor you recognized your own life, your own obedience, your own building in the dark, then share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Not because the numbers matter to this channel, but because there is someone in your life right now who is building something that the people around them do not understand, who is sealing interior walls that no one will ever see, who is hauling timber down roads they built themselves toward a structure that the world around them considers a magnificent waste of time. They need to know that the water is coming, and that what they are building will hold. Like this video if it deepened your faith. Subscribe if you want to go deeper into the stories that shape the world. And leave a comment below. Tell us, what are you building right now, in faith, that the world around you doesn't understand yet? We read every comment, and we will see you in the next story. The flood came. The ark rose. And the story of how it was built, the real story, the one between the lines, is one of the most extraordinary testaments to human faith and divine faithfulness that history has ever recorded. Until next time, build faithfully. The water will come.